So this is the first week devlog for my project Dune Raider. For this first week, I was mostly focused on getting in the basic features. The first one, of course, being terrain generation. You can't really make a sand game unless you have some dunes. So, for this, I used some sine waves and a curve in the Unity editor that I could easily modify to fine-tune the dune shapes. And I just painted it yellow for the time being. Later I would make a shader for this. After I had some dunes in, I got to work on making a board, which was the hard part of that entire day. Because I knew going into this I would have to make my own physics for the surfing, because I needed to treat the sand as being a sort of fluid so that you could turn and have realistic physics behind the surfing and everything. Colliding with the sand was the easy part. All I had to do was apply a force based on the normal of the surface, and I had something that could slide around on the sand pretty easily. The hard part was getting into controlling the board itself by turning and everything. That was a bit more math, and it took quite a few takes to get it to work right. Especially since I also needed to apply a force to keep the board upright as well. So it took a bit of fiddling around with that to get something that worked. And I would have to fine-tune this a lot more later on. Especially once I get to adding in like acceleration. I had to add in some systems for controlling the momentum loss as well. So after that, I had some decent physics going for me for the project, so I decided to add in an actual system for acceleration aside from just pressing the spacebar. And for that, I decided I would use wind to propel the board forward. And I created these wind particles that would float around in the air, and if you were perpendicular to the direction of the wind, you would just accelerate. It took quite a bit of tweaking to get it to how I wanted it to accelerate. I also added a handy-dandy speedometer and accelerometer in the top left of the screen, which I still have to this day. So after that, I decided to revisit the terrain generation and add a bit of noise and purlin to the dunes to make them seem a bit more natural. The result I got from this wasn't too perfect, and it took a lot of messing around to get it just right. And then after that, I also added some structures to the worlds, because I wanted to have more than just sand for miles. I also added a script to continuously add terrain underneath as I surf, because the preset amount would not be enough for testing, and I had to do it eventually. So probably the most difficult part of this first week was the modeling. I decided to start off with the hardest part first, making the character. And I've never really made characters before, and I know it's extremely difficult, so I went with something plain and simple. As you can see here, I just covered up the entire head so that I wouldn't have to model those facial features because I knew they would look terrible. I didn't go for any realistic limbs either, but you're not gonna really be looking at these characters too closely. As for texturing, I went with solid colors because most of the appearance is going to be from shaders, which I will do later. But by far the worst part of this entire process was the rigging. This is the first time I've ever done character rigging, and I knew it would be pretty awful, and it will come back to bite me in the end of the week, where I will do animations, and there you'll see just how bad my rigging was, and I never really get around to fixing it. So after I have the character done, I go ahead and do the board. I put a little sail on the side and everything. I was planning to rig the sail so that it could like be pushed by the wind, but I couldn't really get Blender to cooperate with that. After that, I add him a little spear so he can attack enemies later on when I add them. After that, I do some simple models for the structures you find around the world. A lot of them are ruined and everything to help fit with the uninhabitable desert vibe. And then I make a few little wall fragments as well to litter around the world. So next up is the shaders. I wanted to do a simple cell shading. It took a bit of work because I was using a newer version of Unity than I'm used to. So my typical light function wasn't working properly, so I had to do a bit of research to get that up and running. It took a lot of work to get it to look good with the dunes. Eventually I ended up making a special light curve specifically for the dunes in contrast with all the other objects, just to get them to look good. At this time, there weren't really any shadows either, because I didn't know how to access the shadow map in this version, so I held off on that until later. After I did all the shading for the characters, I did a little bit of skybox work to make the sky look nice, added 2 suns to give that especially hot feeling to the world, and did a bit of coloring for the sand and called it a day on that. After I did the finish the shaders for the sand, I decided I would go and do some work on the particles to update them to URP and also make them just look better. This mostly involved making some... I wanted to get some wake particles for the board, and I also enhanced the wind so that so that you could see the direction it was traveling. I gave it a nice little trail and everything. I tried to make it do like some swirls and everything, but I couldn't really get that to work properly. And finally, the part where my terrible rigging from earlier would come back and bite me. So I wanted to make the character look more alive by tilting with the board to stay upright. I also end up doing an attack animation next week to continue this for that summarizes all the work I did for the first week. It was mostly the basic mechanics and the surfing. Next week is a bit more eventful, but also less productive. I will be posting the video on that shortly, but until then, see you next time.